Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pedestrian Planning and Comprehensive Planning webinar, one of the many interactive technical assistance events being offered through the PlanIt education and training program to planners, consultants, elected officials, and technical staff as local governments prepare for comprehensive plan updates. I am Ariane Avasti, an associate planner in the local planning assistance team at the Met Council. I will be your moderator for today. If you are an AICP member, this event is eligible for 1 CM credit. You must attend the entire event to receive your credit. Credits for participation can be claimed by going to the APA website. Before we start, let's go over some housekeeping information. This information will also be pasted in the chat for your reference. So today's webinar is being recorded. Feel free to turn on live captions within Teams. We will be sharing a link to the webinar with you after the event. We welcome you to revisit the contents yourself and share it with your colleagues. Feel free to enter questions in the chat throughout today's presentation, and our speakers will be happy to answer. We will also have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for more questions and discussion. So today's event will be led by transportation and planning professionals Heidi Schallberg and Corinne Bemis. Heidi Schallberg is a transportation planning analyst with the Met Council. Heidi is the transportation planning lead for pedestrians and safety for the Metropolitan Council. Before coming to Minnesota, she worked for the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Kansas City region, where she worked on complete streets, safety planning, and programming federal funds. Corinne Bemis is a senior transportation planner in multimodal transportation with the Met Council. She is the comprehensive plan lead on the transportation team. Corinne is interested in how we can better connect our transportation and land use planning approaches in the region and has experience working on local land use planning at several metro area cities as a consultant. Joe Whiting, who is present on this webinar, is a transportation planning analyst with the Met Council. He has worked on developing the active transportation program and solicitation, and is now leading the implementation of the program. I'll now turn it over to our experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're good.
For presentation. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm Heidi Schallberg and I'll be doing the bulk of the presentation today. And we'll be covering the pedestrian planning requirements for your 2050 comprehensive plans. Really just wanted to start out kind of reviewing why are we talking about walking for comprehensive plans. We've had a minimal requirement in the past, but we do have some expanded requirements in this round of comprehensive plans. So wanted to go a little bit more in depth about that. And really just kind of the reason for that is this is the one mode we all use in one form or another. So our parents might really celebrate that day that we first take our first steps, but then kind of after that, it sometimes gets taken for granted. But really, we're all walking or rolling. I might make references to rolling, and that's usually for anyone that's using a mobility device, such as a wheelchair or a walker, where they might not always identify with walking. But we see that when we look at our household travel survey, data in the region for the work that we do, more trips are made by walking in the region than are on transit or by biking. And I don't say that to diminish those modes, which are really important, but sometimes we might hear more about those modes than we do about walking, whereas we have about 9% of all trips are made by walking, whereas just a little under 3% for transit and about 1.2 for biking. And I'll also make the point that really, even if you're driving everywhere, all of us are still walking on either end of that trip. So it's really part of everything that we do. Two other reasons that are really important to make sure that we're addressing this across the region are safety and health. So when we look at our safety performance measures for traffic deaths and serious injuries, pedestrians are overrepresented in our deaths from traffic crashes. So they're a higher percentage of our overall fatalities than we would expect from the prevalence of walking. And then when we look at who is killed in those crashes, we found that both Black and Native American residents are disproportionately killed in pedestrian crashes. So it's both a safety and equity issue. And then broader than traffic safety, Walking and having safe environments to do that really improves both our mental and physical health in a lot of different ways. So all of you working for local agencies have that primary responsibility in planning for pedestrians. Where we come in at Met Council in different ways includes kind of assessing those trends, such as looking at household travel survey or our safety performance measures, investing in walking through our competitive funding processes for both federal and regional transportation funds, providing guidance so that for facilities that do support walking and plans that are considering this as a factor, and also that agencies are considering continuity and connectivity between jurisdictions as well, not just within one. In our community development side, the work on setting that overarching land use policy for the region. This is really actually a critical part for supporting walking because it really starts with our land use. If we have destinations that are closer together, that's more supportive of people being able to walk to them versus if we use other land use development patterns, that can make it a more challenging task to try to provide supportive services and facilities. In our role as Metro Transit, of course, as the largest transit operator in the region, we're also interested in ensuring safe, accessible, and convenient pedestrian connections to transit service. And in our role as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, we're responsible for certifying that the Metropolitan Planning transportation planning process complies with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we have 4 minimum requirements for pedestrians in comprehensive plans for this round of plans. The key aspect that I would like to start with is that we're asking that you include a pedestrian element in the transportation section of your plan. So as one of the plan reviewers for the previous round, and it was common sometimes to see it in parks, which is really important in that context. But we're really trying to encourage jurisdictions to shift to thinking about walking as really part of that overall system and that work that we have throughout the region and all of our community types. So I'll go through each of these on the next slides. The first one is to discuss your pedestrian system needs for your community in a way that recognizes your community context, right? So Minneapolis is very different from Osseo. It's very different from other smaller rural township. And so recognizing that every community has different characteristics and your pedestrian networks are going to look different in those different contexts. We are looking for all communities, including rural ones, though, to be looking to address safe options for people traveling outside vehicles. If I could use Google Street View, I'm not allowed to because of copyright in our presentations, but when I was doing review for comp plans last round, I was checking small township, and just in the course of the time when I was just looking at Street View to familiarize myself a little bit more with the area, there were at least 4 people walking on a more rural 2-lane road just in the space of the time that Google Street View was passing through their community. So it's just a good reminder that even in communities that we might not think of as typically being walkable, people still need to get out and be able to do that for various reasons. So one thing that this could be different is that if your community does include existing transit or you're planning for transit service, one aspect we'd really like you to include is looking at those pedestrian connections to those transit stops, like within a half-mile radius of a transit stop, to make sure that there are pedestrian facilities and safe crossings as considerations, because really the bulk of our transit trips are accessed primarily as pedestrians. You could also be considering other priorities based on your community for pedestrian destinations. So these might include schools, community centers, libraries, other local activity centers, such as if you have a downtown or a local shopping area. And in more less dense areas, it could include just something as basic as, can you safely walk to your neighbor's house if you need to share something with them or visit with them? The next one is to describe plans, strategies, or policies to address connectivity gaps in your pedestrian network and to improve accessibility and safety as part of that. This one does just have a sub-bullet as a prompt that if safe routes to school plans have been done for schools in your community, to just identify those. You don't need to include them, but identify that that work has been done. If this is something you're not maybe as familiar with, MnDOT does have a statewide map of safe routes to school work. A lot of it has been funded through MnDOT, and they've funded safe routes to school plans across the state and including in our region. So the graphic on this map is just a slice of that view from the region. So that's a resource that you have just to kind of double check if you're not as familiar if any of that work has been done. And additionally, we have a document at the end of this that we'll be sharing for all of the links that I'm referencing in this, so you'll have access to those at the end. Going back and just kind of reviewing a handful of plans from the last round of comprehensive plans from different community types, from urban, suburban, and more rural communities. These are just some examples of kind of some of the common strategies or policies that communities that were including planning for pedestrians in their previous comprehensive plans were looking at. So this can include things such as removing barriers for pedestrians by building and maintaining that continuous network, improving roadway crossings, working with schools on safe routes to school plans, identifying and filling gaps in your pedestrian network. If your community is looking at having any new development, requiring those pedestrian connections is a big opportunity to make sure that you're addressing in your plan. Some cities have done, in addition to their comprehensive plans, separate active transportation or separate pedestrian plans. And so they may kind of point in that direction for some additional planning work. Also looking at sidewalk maintenance, either policies and implementation to evaluate if there are any changes needed in those. Implementing traffic calming and eliminating identified barriers to accessibility for people with disabilities. The third one is to map your existing pedestrian network. So what you currently have in your community that could be used by pedestrians as specific pedestrian facilities. So I want to emphasize this does not necessarily need to be a GIS map. It can be as basic as you need it to be. And the primary purpose of this map is really to note the presence of those primary pedestrian facilities. Do they exist or not? So that would include things like sidewalks, shared use path that's along the road, it could be used by bicyclists or trails. It might also include pedestrian bridges over highways if you have those in your community. So I just want to emphasize you might have other reasons in your community to want to map other things such as marked crosswalks, pedestrian signals, ADA compliance. You can have that for other reasons, but we are not expecting that level of detail in this map. This really is just a basic level map of where you have any existing pedestrian facilities. The map is a portion of a map example from the city of Richfield, where they have the yellow lines are identifying where they have sidewalks on one side of the street. They have kind of a turquoise line that identifies where they have sidewalks on both sides, and then a blue line for bidirectional trail. And they also identify they have a couple of pedestrian bridges in their community as well. Excuse me. If you're not sure where to start in getting this data, if you're not already familiar with what your jurisdiction might have, one potential source to check would be to see what your jurisdiction's ADA self-evaluation includes. I'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later in the presentation, but basically those are things that all of our governments should have to identify anything, a facility, program, policies that aren't currently to ADA standards. So I'll be really clear, the ADA does not require sidewalks, but where they exist, it does require that they be made accessible. So that might be one source of information for this. We have another webinar on data that I'll also refer to later that talked about OpenStreetMap potentially being a source of data for some communities. And if you don't have that, as a common starting point for some agencies to just get a really basic map can be using aerials and Street View to just kind of do those checks. This fourth one is if it's applicable to your community. So I'll just try to make that clear. We are not requiring you to identify these areas, but if your community has identified pedestrian priority networks or areas, we'd like you to identify and map those in your comprehensive plans. So if you have not identified that, it would also be helpful to just merely include one sentence that says we have not identified any pedestrian priority networks or areas. The Richfield example here, this map showed their existing facilities and the red lines on it. They had identified priority pedestrian routes. And like the Minneapolis example on the left of the screen, that's a common approach to this. If a city wants to identify specific streets and routes as priorities, that can be used both for investment and maintenance. I believe in the past, Minneapolis has used it in part as a guide for where to deploy contractors for clearing snow from curb cuts, as one example. But then St. Paul's priorities identified in their pedestrian plan have a different approach. It's not quite as linear, and it's really more on like a neighborhood or portions of a neighborhood scale where it's broader areas that are identified as priorities for investment in walking facilities. So that covers the ones that are specifically identified for pedestrians. I am going to just touch on one that is in transportation, but it's under equity and inclusion. So if you just look for pedestrians, you're not going to see it there, but it's so closely related. I wanted to make sure to cover this in this webinar so that you're aware of it. So as I'd mentioned a little bit before, every local government, including the council, is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act to do a self-evaluation of facilities, programs, policies, and practices to identify what doesn't meet ADA requirements, with the intent that you then use that information to work to bring those things into compliance with the ADA. So the requirement in the comp plan is relatively straightforward. You are not required to include your self-evaluation in your plan, but we are looking for a brief description of the status of your agency's self-evaluation. For agencies that have 50 or more employees, there is an additional transition plan requirement according to the ADA. And we're looking for this as it relates specifically to public rights of way. So these requirements apply broadly to your whole community. So it would apply to evaluating your city hall if you have a building for that, and different programs that your jurisdiction offers. But we're looking for this in this transportation context because sometimes communities kind of break this up. It can be a big task depending on the size of your community. And so we're interested in the transportation part of that. We're asking you to identify when it was last updated, any identified target date for compliance. So one of the requirements in a transition plan is that you not only have that self-evaluation, but that you have a schedule identified of when you plan to bring those things out of compliance into compliance with the ADA. And any strategies your jurisdiction is using to monitor implementation progress and make updates. So just as a reminder, the ADA is federal civil rights law. The intent is to remove barriers to full participation in society for people with disabilities. And so we just celebrated the 36th anniversary of this law last month. A lot of work has been done, and it's been really important to bring people more into in full inclusion in communities, but we know we still have a lot more to do for that. And this is something that is really intrinsically linked with pedestrian facilities because they can be particularly important to people with different disabilities. I'll emphasize part of the reason in including this too. So we know that people of all ages have disabilities, but one thing is we know people age, disabilities become more common. So when we're looking for the planning horizon of 2050, we know we're likely to have significantly more people with disabilities as the number of the residents that we have who are 65 and older increases. We had several different resources, and again, we'll have a resource at the end of the webinar and will be posted online with the recording as well with a lot of links. There are a fair number of links in this webinar, so hopefully it's a good balance and not overwhelming, but also pointing you to different resources for questions you might have. So the ADA is primarily enforced at the federal level. So the U.S. Department of Justice has resources for city governments about our local government requirements under the Title II of the ADA. We also have, there's a series of federally funded resource centers across the country, and we have one that covers the Great Lakes area. It's based out of Chicago, and it covers Minnesota and Wisconsin, Illinois, and I believe some other states. But so they're a resource center that you can contact. They have resources on the website. You can call them. And one of the specific resources they have created focuses specifically on ADA transition plans in relation to the pedestrian environment. The U.S. Access Board is also a good resource for technical assistance on their accessibility guidelines and standards. And several years ago, our local road research board in the state produced a guide for local governments on how to do ADA transition plans, specifically for public rights of way, and that also includes an element about the self-evaluation. So even if your community isn't at that threshold where you have to do the transition plan because you don't have 50 or more employees, that is a good resource that includes some information about the required self-evaluation. And then we also have a link to MnDOT that includes some resources on accessibility and requirements and guidelines. So that covers all of the required portions. Everything I'm kind of covering from here on out is really in the bucket of getting more out of your comprehensive plan. So this is advisory guidance that's not required to be addressed in your plan. So it's intended to provide some recommendations for communities that may want to do a little bit more robust planning in certain areas. And this is really based on policies that we have, both in the transportation policy plan and just kind of known best practices in the region or across the country. For pedestrians, we have 5 specific recommendations as advisory guidance. And I'll talk about each of those on slides following this. I also really just wanted to touch on, we have this advisory guidance for different categories, both within transportation and across all of the subjects and topics addressed in comprehensive planning. So I really just wanted to point you to some of these others that I'm not going to discuss in detail today, but I wanted to make sure you're aware of them because they're really important topics that are really critical to making more walkable communities across the region. So in transportation, under roadways, we have a couple that are really foundational that apply to all modes, but are really important for pedestrians. One is a complete streets planning resource. So complete streets is when you are thinking about how to plan for and accommodate all users of a roadway across both planning, building, operating, and maintaining. Roadway safety is another one. We will have a separate webinar on safety next month as well. So this is not specific to pedestrians, but really if we're making it safer for pedestrians, it's going to be safer for all people traveling, right? If it's safer for the person in flesh and bone outside of a vehicle, it will be safer for the people inside vehicles as well. Transit guidance, including a previous webinar that we had on transit planning, really is connected to land use and building that walkability into our communities with having the supportive densities and urban forms that really make providing transit possible throughout our region. And so again, that's something that's kind of closely related, even if your community is not doesn't have transit or not planning for it in the future. There's some important concepts in that can apply, and I'll cover one of those on a later slide. And then again, as I mentioned, land use is really a foundation for creating walkable communities. And so that section of our work also includes some guidance on advancing age-friendly communities as well, which is a statewide initiative. So the first recommendation we have that I've already kind of touched on a little bit is planning safe routes to schools. This can be a great way if you haven't done a lot of work on planning for pedestrians to really work with the broader community. And so it's focused on planning for safe and active travel to schools. So this is working with the school districts, local partners such as parent associations and others with the city. It's often led by the school district rather than necessarily the city, but it can look different in different communities. And you can do plans either for an entire school district, or you may do it just for individual schools or groups of schools. I really want to emphasize this means more than just we have a sidewalk and a crosswalk by a school. Safe routes to school, when we talk about that, is really a holistic program that's been around for 20 years now, both at the national and the state levels, designed to encourage and support kids to walk or roll to school as a safe and appealing option. And so this includes typically not just infrastructure, like having the facilities to get there, but non-infrastructure elements. So safe routes to school planning typically is talking about 6 E's is kind of their catchphrase and structure that they use. So you see engineering in there as one of those for those infrastructure treatments. But it also includes other aspects like equity. So paying special attention to parts of your community where you might have more kids in families with lower incomes that might need different types of support or increased emphasis. Engagement and encouragement. So that can take different forms that schools might do as far as programs that they have to encourage kids to be doing this and starting their school days in a more active way that helps them really engage with learning based on research that we found. Education is another piece of this. This can be both for drivers and for the students walking, so how people should be driving around schools, because those are really critical areas. But then educating students as well as kind of how to do that as safely as possible. So that's really a dual role, right? With the drivers having the primary responsibility there. And then evaluation. So a lot of schools will do school tallies in classrooms to try to gauge and track how many students are walking or biking to school. With Minnesota, MnDOT has been a great partner in this and really a national leader in safe routes to school planning. And so we have a statewide website with resources for doing this work. It does include some plan templates that are available. And MnDOT has been doing a lot of funding in this area, including some planning work as well. So if you're interested in learning not just from others in the state, but what people are doing across the country, we are hosting the National Safe Routes to School Conference here in October from the 20th to the 22nd in downtown Minneapolis. So that is a fantastic way to not have to travel very far and be able to learn from people across the country about what they're doing for this work, if this is an area that you're interested in for your community. And then one of the national organizations involved in Safe Routes to School work has also made a short resource available that specifically looks at how you can include these considerations into comprehensive planning. The next one is to collect data on pedestrians. This is one that sometimes it feels like we can be really far behind. We know where all the roads are. We're working on knowing where all our sidewalks are in the region. But even just kind of how many people are out walking in your community, so collecting pedestrian use volume data in key areas. So we did have a webinar on pedestrian and bicycle planning tools in June. So that covered this topic in more detail, and that recording and those slides are available online. And again, the link to that will be in what you get at the end of the webinar and be online. The short message of it is you don't have to figure this out on your own. MnDOT has a manual on how to do it. They have training, and they have counting equipment that you can use to do some automated counts. The other piece of that is, I will also put in a plug, if you do this, we would really love to know about it, because we would love if local communities were also sharing that data with us to get that more broadly across the region. The other type of data that is common would be to look at safety data. So this can be done at different community levels. More of our cities are doing city-specific safety plans, aided by some federal funding from the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. But if your city hasn't done that, one resource you could check is your county road safety plan. So most of our counties in the region have updated county road safety plans that have been funded by MnDOT. So that would be something they're held by the counties, not MnDOT. So check with your county if you don't already know where to find it to see if there's anything identified in that plan that in your community on county roads. Met Council has also, we've done some regional scale data analysis and planning. We've done both a regional safety action plan in 2024. Before that, we did a pedestrian specific safety action plan in 2022. I'm going to point you for pedestrians to start specifically with the newer one. And the reason for that is we did identify regional high injury streets for all modes. So pedestrians are included in that. And that's where we're looking at where there's a concentration of fatal and serious injury crashes. This is something where it's something like just under 2% of our road miles in our regional network represent almost 31% of our fatal and serious injury crashes. So these roads are ones that really have that kind of disproportionate percentage of these more severe crashes. And so we know we have issues there. And that's a great place to start to see if we've identified anything in your community to address. The crash risk index is more not just where crashes have happened, but where other locations that have those risk factors to be more proactive. That does not specifically address pedestrians, but you can use the bicyclist layer for that kind of in combination with transit data. And then MnDOT also has done work on this at the statewide level. The next two are assessing pedestrian barriers, so you can describe and identify what these look like in your community. A lot of times these are thought of as kind of bigger things like railroad lines, rivers, streams, things that you have to cross like that can be difficult. Roadways can be big barriers, especially when they've not been designed to consider how to get pedestrians across them safely. So your higher speed or higher volume roadways could be considered barriers. And then kind of those broader ones about what your network connectivity looks like in your community, or if you have like kind of large swaths where you don't have accessible facilities, those would also be other things that you could consider. Adopting pedestrian policies can either be specific to pedestrians, or it can be policies such as complete streets and Vision Zero that apply to all modes, but those are really, again, really important for supporting pedestrians. Vision Zero is a city-based approach that focuses on the idea that we don't want to have anyone die or be seriously injured from traffic crashes, and so really using that as a starting point for what the city will do to try to get to that goal. Pedestrian specific, if your community is looking at either new development or the potential for redevelopment, this is where it can be really impactful to look at land use and zoning changes so that you can have kind of more supportive design and environments as far as things such as like building setbacks, how close they are to the curb, or if you have to walk through a sea of parking to get there. The last one on this is using demand assessment tools. So again, this was also referenced in that earlier webinar on pedestrian and bicycle planning tools, so I'm not going to go into that in detail, but in short, this image is kind of a slice from a tool that MnDOT makes available called Priority Areas for Walking Score to help identify needs. So that will be available to you in the links. We are working on developing a regional pedestrian and bicyclist demand tool, but that work will continue into next year, so that is not available at this time, but look for that at some point in the future. I just wanted to briefly cover really if you're thinking about both the minimum requirements and if you are doing anything to kind of go beyond those, some important considerations to think about when you're thinking about and looking at how to support walking through planning. And some of the key aspects to consider include safety, directness, comfort, accessibility, and maintenance. So one thing I'd like to emphasize with safety, a lot of times, sometimes people will hear partners who might kind of say, well, we're working on sidewalks and working on trails, and those are really important, right? Having those dedicated facilities where people can be separate from vehicles, those are a key aspect. When we look at the crash data, really the most of our fatal and serious injury crashes for pedestrians are really happening when people are trying to cross streets. So it's really important for us to be providing those facilities along facilities, but also to be thinking about that aspect of how do we get people across from where they are to where they need to be. So this is something when we did the pedestrian safety action plan, it's probably intuitive to many of you, but it's really the crash risk is correlated with how many travel lanes, or basically how wide the road is you have to cross, how fast the drivers are going, and how many vehicles are there. The good news is that we have tools that can help improve safety for pedestrians with infrastructure. So the bottom graphic is just some examples of some of the proven safety countermeasures that the Federal Highway Administration highlights as based on research. We know these can have measurable improvements in safety for people walking and biking, so they can include not just the walkways like sidewalks and trails, but different signal treatments, and things such as medians and crosswalk treatments. And again, we'll have a separate webinar that goes more into safety. So directness, people really take, especially when you're walking, take the most direct path. It's a mode where it's sensitive to your physical ability or sensitive to the environment, whether it's cold, whether it's hot, whether it's raining. And so that's really something that supports a walkable community, is to have those direct, shorter distances. This graphic is actually from the transit chapter of our transportation policy plan. So walkability is supporting transit too, but what this is illustrating is really that walkability piece, because without that, it does make providing transit more challenging as well, because the majority of our transit trips are accessed by walking. So in that first example, it says transit supportive, or more or less. It's also walkable in that sense. So it is more ideal to have like a street grid with shorter blocks, so you have shorter trip distances to get from point A to point B to where you want to go. The less transit supportive or less walkable areas might be where you have cul-de-sacs, kind of more curvilinear roads. One thing I will point out, this may not necessarily help transit service directly as far as vehicles driving on the roads, but some communities can look at, if you have the opportunity, especially in any new development, even if you are continuing this type of street pattern, it can be possible at times to do kind of pedestrian cut-throughs to make some more pedestrian-specific connections between cul-de-sac areas where you either have the right-of-way or can get easements. And then the bottom two examples are really kind of more in relation to the buildings and the built environment, right? Is it right along the street, where you have shorter distances to go, or is it kind of more of a big box environment where you might have a sea of parking that may or may not have been designed to easily have people walk through it to connect to the building that you want to get to? Comfort is something that can be really individual, but there are a lot of things that we commonly hear about in our planning processes. And shade will, of course, become even more important as our temperatures in Minnesota increase. This can best be designed by trees, provided by trees, but I know that it can be challenging in some areas with either right-of-way space and constrained areas. Some communities have been using some creative options to try to provide shade in areas where they can do kind of a cover over a narrower street or area. So I've seen examples with umbrellas or things that have been knitted. So if you don't have the ability to include trees in areas that you're planning for people to walk about, think about other ways that you might be able to, with either awnings or overhangs, other ways to have that, or even in pockets along the way. Places to sit and rest, as mentioned, are really important to support all abilities for people to travel this way, because we are depending on that physical exertion. Lighting at a pedestrian scale also relates to safety, but really can make a big difference in how comfortable someone feels being in a space. And then navigation and wayfinding. So if you start walking somewhere, will you be able to determine, like especially if you're on a trail or if you're in a downtown area, how do you get to where you want to go, where the main points of interest are? And another thing we've heard through some of our planning processes are access to drinking water and restrooms are always key. So it's not something you're going to necessarily always be providing as a transportation project, but when you're planning across the different areas, that can be something to consider. Accessibility goes beyond just the ADA that we were talking about, and it's something that really supports all of us. So one thing you may commonly hear from people who have disabilities is that the idea that we're all temporarily abled, and any one of us, through just life happening, can become part of the group of people with disabilities at any time. And so it's important to understand that ADA requirements are just a minimum. That's just kind of the legal minimum requirement. The ADA doesn't address every type of disability or all needs. So just because something meets the ADA doesn't mean it's fully accessible to all the different needs that might be out there. And some disabilities are not as visible, right? So you can't necessarily look at someone and determine if they have a disability. So we have people who might have cognitive or sensory disabilities that might need considerations and things such as wayfinding to have clear and direct communication. Really, the best advice is to just work with people in your communities who have different types of disabilities so that they're helping you to identify what those different needs are and what the desired improvements are in your community. And just also make the point that a lot of times making accessibility improvements really ends up helping everyone. So the classic example here are curb ramps. Those were designed to try to help somebody using a wheelchair or other mobility device get across the street. But over time, we find parents with strollers, travelers with suitcases, and others. So this is something that really broadly in the end will help all of us in our communities. Lastly, maintenance. So people need to walk year round. We're a winter state and we have a lot of it some years. And this is also something we tend to hear about in our regional planning processes about the need for reliable snow and ice clearance for people to be able to continue to do that year round. This is addressed by jurisdictions in different ways. So some jurisdictions might just require property owners to do it. Others might have kind of more of a mix where the jurisdiction might clear snow and ice on certain types of facilities and then have property owners do others. I also might mention that maintenance is a year-round issue. So snow and ice are one of the ones we tend to hear about a lot, but also considerations like trimming trees or other greenery to kind of maintain a clear path and visibility are important, as well as just monitoring those sidewalk and trail surfaces so that they're level and safe for people to be walking and rolling through. Again, we'll have a document with all of these links, but there are a lot of resources out there to help you with planning for pedestrians. There's also a National Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center that has a wealth of resources in it and a lot of examples from across the country and how to plan and implement for pedestrians. For any of you who are working in a small town or rural context, I would really encourage you to take a look at Federal Highway Administration's Small Town and Rural Multimedia Networks document. So this is guidance specifically for those contexts on how you can be thinking about accommodating those needs in those different community contexts and what that looks like and how it's different from a more urban area. MnDOT does provide a fair number of resources related to walking, and I'll also call it the Minnesota Department of Health has an active living group that does a lot of work in this area. So they've worked on holding walkable community workshops across the state, including in the region, and they have a series of 5 videos on that topic, as well as some guides on how to do walk audits. So that could be part of the work that you may choose to do as part of your comprehensive plan. They have produced a sidewalk snow clearing guide, and there's also a link on there to Minnesota Walks, which was done several years ago in partnership with the Department of Health and the Department of Transportation to really provide that vision for being a state that's really supportive of people walking. And so that document can provide some example strategies. That's really a key aspect of that document. So if you're looking at ideas for what your community should be thinking about for this aspect of your plan, that could be a good resource. I also mentioned briefly that we have a sales tax. We have funding specifically for walking and biking through a regional transportation sales and use tax that started a couple of years ago from the state legislature for our region. So we just completed an application round for funding. We're in the process of scoring those applications. So I did just want to raise this as a possibility, though. We are talking about when to do the next round of funding for that, when to open the next set of applications. So we are having conversations about doing another round of funding in 2027. Kind of put in bold, it's not confirmed yet, so this is not final, but I just wanted to put it on your radar because this could be a potential source of funding for you to do some additional planning, depending on both the timing for your comprehensive plan work and if we end up doing that in 2027, because that funding does have an application category specifically for planning. Next up, we have 2 more webinars scheduled in the transportation series for PlanIt. So kind of probably the polar opposite of pedestrian planning is aviation planning, the beginning of September. And then I will be doing a follow-up one on safety planning. So we have some new requirements on that for comprehensive plans. Again, that would apply to all modes, but is really important for pedestrians as well on September 22nd. And then I would like to turn it over. We don't have a slide for it, but I wanted to turn it over verbally to Corinne, who has another opportunity to make you aware of.
Thanks, Heidi. So I'll just do a quick little plug for an event that is coming up in October in partnership with the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD's Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Team. The Met Council will be hosting a summit on the connections between land use and transportation planning. Like I mentioned, this is going to occur in early October, and all communities in the region will be receiving a survey to show interest in the event with some more information on the event, and that'll be coming soon. Thanks.
Thank you. And with that, that's everything that we had for today. So, sorry, get back over to my screen to show the final slide, which just basically has a really cool graphic. And so that would be happy to answer any questions, try to answer any questions anyone might have.
Yeah, thank you both for this great presentation. To close, it would be greatly appreciated if you could also complete this short survey, which will appear in the chat here. Your feedback will help improve PlanIt events in the future. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.